Hey guys, what's going on? It's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Today we're going to be talking just a little bit about algae, about Diatomaceous algae, and that's the hard stuff, the kind of powdery looking stuff that will get on your tank, sometimes on the glass, especially when it's new. We'll also be talking about the Filamentous algae that you get in between plants and things, and we'll take a look at it down here in one of my tanks. I've got examples of both kinds, and we're going to talk about the key question that I've been hearing a lot lately online, which people are asking, Alex, is it true that you can get algae from not having enough light? And the answer is yes, kind of. So I want to get into that, and maybe by the end of this, you guys will kind of have followed me on the journey and understand why it is that you're getting the algae you are getting. Because a lot of people know why they get algae when they have high nitrates and high light. It's obvious why they're getting algae. But other people, they have low light, very low light, and they're still getting algae, and it's, they're trying to figure out what's going on. So we're going to talk about that end of the spectrum, why you can get algae when you have almost no light. In fact, you can get it on an aquarium that doesn't have an aquarium light on it. It's just in a room with the ambient light or the light coming in the window. So let's get this camera frame off my mug and onto some algae, onto some fish, just as something better to look at while we talk about this. So let's take a look at the star of this show, the algae. Alright, here we are. We have some classic Diatomaceous algae. Now, Diatomaceous algae is made out of diatoms. Go figure, right? But basically, this is one of the oldest types of algae. And let's just go over some basics really quick in case we need a refresher. And that is essentially that algae grows when there is too much nitrogen, phosphorus, and also other nutrients, but those are the two main ones. When there's too much nitrogen and too many phosphates, which is phosphorus in various forms, in the water column, in the open water, and there aren't enough plants or water changes removing that. And so then when we get light in our aquarium, there's these little tiny life forms that will be able to use that excess energy, and to great effect, they're able to then create colonies and build off surfaces and create little things like this. Now, we get diatomaceous algae. What you need in order to grow the hard, crusty algae that can grow on the glass that you need a razor blade to scrape off, what you need to grow that algae is actually silicate. And silica, silicone in natural form, you can get that from either sand, and sand being broken down in the environment here. You can get it from contaminants in the water or somewhere along the production line of parts in your aquarium. And then also, it's a different kind of silicone, but you do have silicone as the sealant on the glass that holds our entire aquarium together. So there is some ambient silicone that could be in the water that various bacteria can break down, and then once it's broken down, it can be metabolized within a number of weeks into the diatomaceous algae. Now, when we think about our aquariums, diatoms and algae, so we'll take a look at more types of algae. So here's more diatom algae right on the front of the glass. And in this room, why are we getting it here? Well, there's a big window right here, and the sun is coming in this window for half the day because it's facing south. And so when we look in here, we see that it's growing in this tank. Now, this tank had some fish in here that were medium-sized cichlids for a long time, some apistos and some cribs, and then it also had gouramis and a number of other, little community fish. But enough that they were making nitrates, and the food they were eating was oftentimes falling down, getting lost, and making nitrates. So the typical algae creation was happening up up here with green hair algae. So you'll see that, like here, you'll see green hair algae is a little different. And if we try to find some of this stuff, it's stringy, it kind of all sticks together and you can wind it up. It's a different type of algae. Now this is not made, its cell walls are not made of silicate or little crystals basically. They're little squares, and if you look at them under the microscope, which we have in other videos, which you can check out on the channel, they look like little boxcars, like a train of little squares stuck together. And they form these fibers, or filamentous algae, green hair algae, some people call it, but it likes to grow in between points of plants or hardscape and things like that, and you'll get it growing in between, you know, various areas, and then it kind of strengthens along those same paths, and pretty soon it turns into a tangled mess and starts taking on a life of its own. Now, one of the issues you get with this is that it actually starts to coat the plants, and then because the plants are using photosynthesis, well, the algae is using photosynthesis as well. So when we have a high light, like this is a Fluval 3.0, which for the sake of this video, we're going to call high light. I know that that may not be high light for some aquascapers and some specialized plants, but for your average hobbyist, this is a pretty strong light and a really good light that I recommend. And you can set it at a very high setting. Mine is set all the way up right now, and I could dial it back and probably get rid of a lot of this filamentous algae, because along with this filamentous algae, we don't have a huge bioload of fish causing nitrates and phosphorus and things like that. But yet again, we do have a sand-based substrate, so there are silicates in here, and so that means we need to be on alert for the start of diatom algae. There's some water spots on the outside of the aquarium, but more than that, you can see where these cories are coming up on the glass. There's actually the start of some little speckling of diatomaceous algae, and down here, it's not getting direct light from any sunshine. So what's going on with that, and how can we stop that? And this is happening in highlight, whereas we have this tank here that has just a cheapo Aquarium, basically a kit light that would have come with an aquarium set. It's one of the lower power LEDs, and yet we're still seeing a ton of it here too. But we're not seeing the filamentous algae. So what's going on there? Let's talk about that a little bit in this next segment. Alright, so back to the Diatomaceous algae. Same with this light here. This is a very inexpensive knockoff, no-name brand. Literally, I don't know if you can make this out. We'll take a look at the reflection. But there's not even that many diodes on this light. They're just generalized white light. I'd consider it medium to low intensity. So what's so important about this is, in this tank, we know that there was the sand, and or there could be silicone. We're going to argue for the sake of this video that your tank is cycled, because it's very common when you have a new aquarium to get algae. In fact, it's almost inevitable that you'll go through a phase where you start getting algae. And in this tank here, we actually have hair algae too. Now this is from a Marimo moss ball, which obviously you probably know, but it isn't moss, it's actually a form of algae. And you can see here, it breaks off and forms, and here it's growing on booths, it's growing on this manzanita wood. It will grow on any surface that you let it, basically. But it's very similar to the diatomaceous algae in the way it grows, and that is that it needs the phosphorus in the water, in phosphate form, and it needs the nitrogen. So what's happening, where could we get rid of it? Well, if we got rid of all of the nitrogen, we would probably fix the problem, right? But then what do we do about the plants that truly need nitrogen to survive? We have low light plants in here. For the most part, we've got some lilies, we've got moss, we've got an onion plant, bulb plants and some crypts that really, use the energy from their roots at a slow pace. And then we have Anubias, bucephalandra, some larger booths, and Bulbitis African ferns, basically, water ferns. And the thing about the question, can you get algae because you don't have enough light, because your light's too low? Yes, in the sense that these are all slow growing plants. So if we're not doing enough water changes to get rid of that excess phosphorus, phosphates, and nitrates, as well as other nutrients that plants and algae use to grow, there's micronutrients, you know, iron, nickel, magnesium, manganese. I could go on, but they're not as important for this story. And obviously carbon is very important for all life forms too. But what's happening here is we don't have enough light energy to be fueling these plants to eat it fast enough that it outcompetes the algae. Right now, and because I want algae growing on all these rocks because of all my little gobies that are in here, and they're kind of sleeping right now, but there are a whole bunch of Stiphodon gobies that need biofilm in here in order to survive and thrive. And because of that, I want the algae, I want the diatoms, and I want what we call aufuchs, which are bacteria, fungi, and little teeny microorganisms all living together in these sheets of kind of sliminess on the walls of your aquarium. I have a whole video on that, as well as getting rid of the algae with highlight in highlight situations in, you know, tanks where you've got a bunch of plants also. But here what we're saying is that these plants are all so slow at growing. Even if I did throw the planted Fluval 3.0 like I have down here on that tank, they wouldn't be able to keep up with pulling out the nutrients out of the water. Even if I tried to give them the quote-unquote steroid injection of using gaseous CO2, you know, CO2 injected pressurized gas like you would use in an aquascape, that would not be enough to pull it out. However, down in this tank, we do have a plant, hornwort, as well as nausea grass, or guppy grass, that grows fast enough that we should be able to outcompete the algae if we have enough light. And so in theory, you can outcompete algae by turning up the light, turning up the CO2, but you need plants that are able to rip all of the extra nutrients out of the water. And so it's a fine balancing game. These plants are all floating here, and you can see there aren't many plants in this tank at the bottom that are in the substrate. So you can cheat the algae, and you can feed your plants with root tabs and bury the root tabs so they don't leach nutrients out into the water column. You can cheat the algae, and that will feed your plants at their roots, where they're really good at processing, eating those nutrients. And then they'll also feed from the water column too, but the algae won't get that same benefit of feeding from the root column. Now CO2 can be the same, but it can also feed the algae. Now when we're talking about algae, it is a very clever organism. It has been around for probably some sort of pre-algae or algae-like creature organism, single cellular, has been around for probably 3.4 billion years, that something has been able to use the sun, turn it into energy. But algae does not hold sugars. It does not hold or does not create sugars itself. It does not rearrange them and create sucrose or you know, any of the organic glucose and things like that in any large amount. Whereas plants, well, they're sturdy enough that they can, and so that gives us another edge in that they can create both starches and sugars, and they can convert their starches to sugars and energy, basically. And so we can turn off the light, and yet again, we're undercutting that algae. The algae then does not have a chance to feed because it doesn't have the light. The light is kind of like the workers who show up at the construction site. And the algae is the construction site building. And they're building it, and they need to build this skyscraper, this big ball of algae. And if there's no workers, no light, nothing's going to happen. However, on the same flip side of things, if we have a low light setup and slow-growing plants that aren't feeding from the roots. So remember, we said if it's feeding from the roots, from root tabs, then that is food that for the plants that the algae can't get. It's underneath the substrate, and it's a trick to feed the plants and not the algae. Well, when it's in the water column, then you need plants that feed from the water column, like hornwort, like wisteria, like water sprite, and the ones here. But when the light's too intense, as we said, it starts growing the algae up here. So what happens if we were to dial back this light? Even though this tank, assuming I was doing more water changes, we could get rid of this filamentous algae very quickly also. But you can see that we're starting to get also hair algae down here and diatomaceous algae on the sides. Now this tank's about 3 months old, and it's because it's entering this phase that it's trying to find an equilibrium. And a little trick that a lot of people don't know or think about is that you need bunches of types of algae in your aquarium. So if you want an aquarium that looks, say, like this tank is 5 years old. You can see there's white algae, there's green algae, there's actually red and darker brown algae on the rocks. There's all sorts of different species in here. There's actually black hair algae, black beard algae on some of the stuff. There's diatom algae over here, and yes, there are traces of filamentous algae also. But they all keep each other in check, and these plants are all feeding from substrate. So they're feeding from the waste of these fish, and the amount of waste, the amount of nitrates and phosphorus in this tank are very low because we're not putting much food in here. The fish are eating planaria and little grubs and little critters that are in here already. These are panda loaches, and they are able to forage in this little ecosystem very well. Same with the shrimp, and the shrimp eat the algae, so shrimp are another hack to help you. Yet this light here, again on this tank, just like on the betta and gourami tank, it is very low power. And this tank's even closer to this window and gets even more light. So I just wanted to show you that it is possible to only have, minimal amounts of that algae on the sides. I allow it to form to some degree because, like I said, when there's 15 types of algae, they all compete for a spot and no one monoculture takes over. Whereas in a newer tank where there's 2 or 3 kinds, they're all competing, and right now it looks like the hair algae is going to win. It's able to utilize the free nutrients in the water. And if we were to turn this light way down, what would happen? Would we starve the algae? Well, this is the problem, and this is the answer to our issues. If we could black out all the natural light coming in, if we could black out the light from these tanks, black out the lights from the ceiling and from everything else, then algae will generally die within 3 days because, like we talked about just a minute ago, it can't store sugars. And so it has no reserve food. It has no fat, it has no meat on the bones, so to speak. But the bummer about the diatomaceous algae, this stuff, is that because it uses silicone or silicate in its structure, it actually forms these little pyramids and geometric shapes that are really hard. They're really rigid, and they're almost like little crystals. They look like little jewels, and under the microscope, they're very, very hard. And so you're still going to have to chip them off, even if they're not alive and photosynthesizing. So say we turn off all the lights again, and we're going to still have to chip off the diatomaceous algae. So it may not be growing anymore, but now we just have to worry about the hair algae and any filamentous algae going on. And again, here's these little gobies that I'm growing out all these algae and biofilms for. So the problem is that algae has been around 3.4 billion years. It's been around for basically 3 billion years longer than plants. Plants have probably been around for around 500 million to 400 million years, depending on what you call a plant. If you call lichen and moss and things like that a plant, then probably more like 500 million years. And if you count something more like trees and seaweed, and you want leaves and pine needles and those sorts of things, then you're probably going to lean more towards the 400 million years. But regardless, they're much more complex. They have a whole system to store that energy. So if we kill all the light to this, the plants are newer. They're more evolved in the sense that they were able to withstand periods when the climate may have gotten really dark. Maybe it was volcanic eruptions, maybe it's just really dark and cloudy and rainy, and then the plants live at the bottom of the forest. Boy, that guy just caught a shrimp. But they're able to have this extra glucose and energy, and they will live for 5 days without the light, whereas your algae will start to die, which is what we want, right? We don't want it around anymore. So when we're thinking about doing all that, you want to make sure that you're still doing water changes and getting out as much of the free-floating energy than you can. Now, a side note, just an interesting side note, while we're talking about algae and energy and evolution and the planet, one really crazy fact about the Amazon is it is very phosphate deficient. It doesn't have enough phosphorus and phosphates for the plants to grow on its own. They all get washed out to sea, and the Congo is very similar. But because of algae that died and those really hard crystals that are a pain in the butt to get off of your glass or off of your hardscape and rocks, those still have the silicate trapping phosphates in them, and they are in the dust, they're in the sand, all the way in the Sahara Desert. And when giant windstorms kick it up into the atmosphere, it both acts as a nucleation point for rain, so raindrops form around that up in the upper atmosphere, water forms around these little teeny tiny particles, and then it falls to earth, and the phosphates then fall into the Amazon. And every year there are enough phosphates coming from Africa in the form of dust particles in the atmosphere to keep all that beautiful rainforest alive and well. So, just a little side tangent that I think it's a beautiful thing about how our planet works, and why when weather patterns change, there can be big consequences, for many things. And the dust from a desert across the world can have an impact on the plants in a jungle on the other end of the world. But back to turning off the lights and finishing up this conversation. So we turn off the lights and they'll starve. But if you have an underpowered light like I do on these tanks, the big issue is that then that algae, that tricky algae that's had 3 billion years to figure out how to survive, it can survive in low light. Now, plants can survive in low light because they've got that food reserve. They've got that sugar, that starch, protein, whatever it may be that they've stored depending on the plant species. But the algae doesn't have as much of a trick for that, and they live more by multiplying when they can and dialing it back when they don't have the excess energy. And so when there's even the light from, say, this tank being lit up, or these tanks, and if I didn't have any light on here, that would be enough light to grow Diatomaceous algae especially, but it might even be enough to grow the hair algae and things. So yes, you can get algae from your lights not being bright enough because of what's already going on in your tank, and that is the underlying condition of, one, you don't have a light that's strong enough. And plants that are growing fast enough, we'll take a look 1 second at some plants that are growing very quickly with the CO2 injection, so you can see the difference between no CO2 and CO2 and what that does for eating up the algae and nutrients as well. But here, say, your plants still need foods and things. They need fertilizers of some sort and micronutrients, and oftentimes when we dose those, we're feeding the algae slightly too, because it's a very hard balance, and you would need to know exactly how much each plant is eating of what nutrient compound, and make sure there's none extra in the water for your algae. And so that's why root tabs are helpful if you can't get that balance right at a time. Don't keep dosing the liquid energy unless you have really strong highlights and fast growing plants that are eating from the water column. But if you have Anubias, Java fern, those slow growing plants, it doesn't matter if you have the sun, the brightest light in the world, you know, they will not be able to outcompete using that energy in the water column. So let's go take a look at what they would look like in high highlight. So here we have an aquarium with very highlight, to the point that you can see the CO2. There's not even CO2 in here right now. It was in here earlier today. These two tanks share it. But these plants, these Rotalas, these Ludwigias, they use so much energy and so much of the nutrients in the water that there isn't room for Diatomaceous algae to grow on the rocks or the glass. There's just none in the water. The nitrates are near zero, if not zero. And if it goes up a little bit, then you can get a big algae spike all of a sudden. But this has a Fluval 3.0 light and an Archeon light that are both on max, and they're on long hours every day. Whereas if we were trying to establish a new tank and dial in our fertilizers and things, we'd probably only want that light on 6 hours a day, and you want it really, really bright. But when it's not on, you want it completely off, because the reason we're getting these reds and beautiful colors like that is because there's not much nitrogen in this water, but there's all the other nutrients. And so these plants are hungry for it, and they're trying to grow as fast as they can, and they're doing photosynthesis, and they're putting off all these little bubbles of oxygen, which we call pearling. And that pearling that's going on is photosynthesis happening in action. We know that it's working. We know that the plants are using up the energy in the tank. We know specifically that they're ripping the carbon out of gas form, or out of the form that fish make in waste, and they're using it as little building blocks in their cells, which obviously algae can do too. But here, again, we have a twin star light, and we have CO2 injection actively going, and no algae anywhere to be found other than a little bit on the stone itself. And that's because the highlight and all these plants, they're using nutrients that's packed into the soil that can't be accessed in the water column, and we're keeping up on our water changes. But like I said, if this was off and we were just getting ambient light, even, hi guys, even from outside or from the lights in the room, you know, these lights, that would be enough. That those 3 billion years of evolution would allow the diatomaceous algae, maybe even hair algae, but definitely red algae and diatomaceous algae, definitely would allow them to start growing, and the plants would not be utilizing the nutrients because they don't have the light. Now, if you had Anubias or plants, you know, like that are slow growers in that low light, it can be even worse because they're not utilizing it because they're in low light, but your algae is able to grow, and they're not even eating the nutrients out of the water because they don't have enough light. So in the end, you're probably always better turning up the light from low light and having plants like stem plants or floating plants to utilize that food in the water. And you can always dial back on your dosing of liquid ferts or root tabs and things. But the root tabs are kind of like steroids for the plants that will also feed up top out of the water. So I hope that explains a lot about algae and maybe answers a whole bunch of questions for you guys, and maybe allows you to choose which variables you want to change in your own tank. So if you like this, please hit the like button. It's a dry subject, it's a nerdy subject, but it's a necessary one, and one of the secrets that lives in your aquarium. So if you enjoyed this, I'd appreciate, you know, a share or leaving a comment about what you do for algae, or if you agree with me. I mean, there's different takes on things, and every type of water, every type of plant and fish tank is going to be different. I'm not claiming to have the answer. I'm just claiming that this is the answer and the system that works best for me. So have a good one, you guys, and I'll talk to you next time.